Hello, everyone. This is Whitney Will from StarHearth Astrology. This is going to be a long one, so hold tight. In this episode of Duly Noted podcast, or if you're watching the video version on YouTube, just a kind of transit check-in, I'm going to be talking about the end of the Mars retrograde and the upcoming Venus retrograde, because we are in the part of the year where they are doing a little bit of a handoff. I wanted to recap the Mars retrograde because so often with astrology, we jump forward and we're moving forward and we're just looking to the future, blah, 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 and not necessarily using the tools that we have to process our experience, which, as a therapist, is a key piece of the work that we're doing here. And I feel like if we're only looking forward with astrology, we're missing out on half of its usefulness and recognizing patterns and developing self-awareness and integrating our experiences. Here we go. I'm thinking about this Mars retrograde and what has come of it in my own life. And so I'm going to share a little bit of my personal experience, and hopefully it is useful for you too, because I'm really left in the space with this kind of mantra about facing your pain. Now, I am not a Mars person. I have Mars in Libra, where it's in its detriment. It's my out of sect malefic. It's in the ninth house, where it shows up in a kind of intellectual way rather than a physical way. Mars in air signs tends to be a little bit anxiety ridden and a little bit frenetic intellectually, and I definitely feel those things. I am also in a 10th house year. My 10th house is Scorpio, and so my Lord of the year is Mars. So I am a not Mars person in my Mars year. So I knew it was going to be a more challenging year. It's also the 10th house, so a very important year. And what happened in the middle of my Mars retrograde? I got my full license to practice therapy without a supervisor and no longer an associate. So I'm fully licensed in the state of Washington. That felt very much like a kind of culmination, a 10th house year thing. I have new letters after my name. I started seeing clients in person in an office. It's been a good career year. But what I've run into in the Mars retrograde period specifically is different ways that in my life I am ambivalent and avoidant, and I create harm in my relationships because I'm not using my Mars enough. I'm not being assertive enough about what I want and what I'm doing. And that's complicated in my chart because Mars in Libra is ruled by my Venus, who is retrograde. So that ambivalence creates pervasive patterns that mean that I try to avoid conflict in ways that doesn't work. I have been reading a lot of fantasy fiction, which I think lots of people are, and I think it has to do with Neptune on the North Node in Pisces and this kind of last burst of fantasy. But in the last book I was reading, The Assassin's Blade, so I've been reading all of Sarah Maas, there is a situation where one character is trying to understand the cruelty and the betrayal of another. And one of her teachers is talking about how some people experience great pain and they respond to it by suffering and sadness and feeling it and mourning the loss, and it drags them down. But their primary response to pain is sadness and grief. And there are some people who their response to their pain is anger. And so they make it through their pain with anger. And then there is another sense, which is facing it and understanding that these deep betrayals and injustices happen, that they're real, and that there is still life and a positive world on the other side of those things. And that when we decide to face and integrate our pain, then we avoid, not avoid, but we choose life instead of collapse and instead of rage, right? Neither despair nor hatred. And that's so hard because that one's a mixed bag. And we like to come out strongly against things. And so I've been reflecting on that statement really as a kind of gem and an encapsulation of the Mars retrograde, especially with Mars retrograde in Cancer, which largely leans into the mourning and grief and sadness and even wallowing and sense of helplessness, of pain. And Mars stationed on Saturday at 17 degrees of Cancer. 17 degrees of Cancer is my south node, my broken, stuck in the old Cancer stories, and mourning the softness and the gentleness, and mourning the sense of the perfect family and the emotional intimacy and the emotional safety. And I have habitually been a griever and a wallower. I thought that I was going to be a griever for my whole life. And yet life comes to you and faces you and says, here's this challenge. Do you want it? Here's this thing that you said that you wanted. Can you fight for it? Are you going to fight for it? How are you going to face this opportunity? Because opportunities can change us as much as our hardships and can be as difficult to step up and meet. And so I have been really, instead of trying to avoid my pain and then feeling a sense of despair about the world or whatever, to just face it, to just say, yes, there is pain. Yes, there is pain. Yes, this is hard. And having the courage to feel it and also participate. So I've been feeling really grateful in that sense. I lost a friend to suicide, and so I've been deep in the grief recently, which is also one of the reasons why I haven't been posting so often. Just processing loss and grief. Down there in my Cancerian South Node with Mars, do not use your grief as an excuse to not rise and meet the world and do your work in the world, to be dishonest in some way because you're afraid of hurting somebody. Pain is a part of relationships. We hurt people we love because we have to change. That's the law of everything. Everything is temporary. And so leaning into that as Mars begins to slowly move forward, integrating these things. We still have a long journey. Mars will be in the shadow of its retrograde until May 1st and will be in Cancer until mid-April. We have the third pass of Mars through Cancer. And hopefully, if we've done the work during the retrograde, that can be an integration of the lessons. Now, we are settling down and integrating in a weekly way our work towards the Pisces new moon that happens on February 27th at 9 degrees of Pisces. This new moon is the last lunation before we enter eclipse season. It's also interesting because normally I would be talking about how this is the last uneclipsed new moon for a number of years. But actually, none of the Pisces new moons are solar eclipses. The solar eclipses completely sidestep Pisces this eclipse season. So we only have lunar eclipses in Pisces, and we will go from having an Aries solar eclipse this spring, and next spring we will have an Aquarius solar eclipse, and there won't be Pisces ones. So you can make of that what you will, but there's something about the new beginning in Pisces, right? Like maybe there's been enough of these revelations in Pisces with the movement of Neptune through Pisces since 2011 and Saturn and Pisces since 2023. We've been doing so much work in that space. This is almost, right, a beginning that is a more restful beginning, perhaps. This is not a bad new moon. I really like it. In fact, it is in a square to Jupiter in Gemini, which is just curious and expansive. It can feel overwhelming emotionally, and it's asking us to dive deep. Dive deep in our faith, and much will be revealed to us over the next as we step into our Venus retrograde. So in the trade-off between Mars and Venus, we are passing the baton from reflecting on what we are capable and competent and willing to fight for, and what it is that we desire, what is worth fighting for. The astrologer Austin Coppock talks about the Venus retrograde experience as searching for the unambiguous, the unambivalent, yes, the enthusiastic, yes. So if you're feeling a little bit like in your life, frustrated with your relationships, frustrated with your job, frustrated with patterns and stuff, feeling a little bit antsy, right? We've got Venus right now. She's the old crone. She's at the end of her cycle that began in the summer of 2023 when she went retrograde in Leo. And now she is at her maximum elongation away from the sun. She is a gorgeous evening star, but she is also an old woman in this situation. And so she's in the period of integrating these things, of looking back on the last cycle. And then she will descend down towards the sun, and she will strip off her finery and her power, and she will be reborn as the morning star. And we will go on a new journey of desire. So Venus will station retrograde on March 1st at almost 11 degrees of Aries. And this degree is so important. You may remember from my year ahead videos, because we also have Mercury stationing very close to this degree, and our final Aries solar eclipse is happening very close to this degree, about a month from when Venus stations retrograde. So there's something very potent about 9 to 11 degrees of Aries. And obviously, if you have planets there, but also if you have them at 9 to 11 degrees of any of the cardinal signs, they are going to be very much affected by this. Go in to Venus retrograde. We are going deep within our hearts to connect with desire, and desire not in this kind of selfish consumerism way, but desire as in your innate magnetism to your fate and what belongs to you. What you seek is seeking you. And if we are not going into that space and connecting with that, then what we can seek can have a much more surprising and much more destructive effect on things. So in the spaces where we are ambivalent, we need to connect, not just with our minds, not just what we think we want, but with what our heart and our Venus is pulling towards us. What we are saying and or not saying, needing together. Part of Venus's station, retrograde on March 1st, is also Mercury entering the shadow of its retrograde. Mercury is at 26 degrees, almost 27 degrees of Pisces, and from there it enters the shadow of its retrograde. It will not go retrograde until March 14th. So we have a couple weeks of it being in the shadow period. But these retrogrades are so closely connected because they span almost exactly the same degree that first we're going to do it with our heart, and then we're going to do it with our mind in a way that can be communicated. So the beginning, all you need to do is feel. You do not need words for it. You don't need a map for it. Just feel. And in the spirit of Aries, if you can do it in a spontaneous way, so just letting it happen, what moves you? What no longer moves you? What has eros and libidinal energy, which often gets sexualized, but is just this life force energy in it? Can you smell it in your life? And can you go find what it is? Or at least follow the path, or at least find the direction. You do not have to map out the whole thing because that would be ridiculous. The world is changing so much, so quickly in the next year and the next 5 years. The path of how to get somewhere, we are changing the dimensional nature of how we do things. The rate of change is accelerating so fast that the old playbooks that we have for things will no longer be relevant. And honestly, we have known that they are less and less relevant for a very long time. And so Venus in Aries is about reconnecting to the primal rage that is the creative force of the universe, that is the fierce desire to be something in the world. It is creation. And when she stations retrograde, we're reflecting on that piece. And when Venus stations retrograde, it's almost as though she goes into a period of withdrawal, because if Venus's nature is to connect us, when she goes retrograde, she loses that. And so there is a tear in the social fabric. We will see things getting more chaotic and more angry. In the world, Venus retrogrades tends to be periods of social unrest and large protests. And I think we will see more of that. And if that resonates for you, participate in it. Let the mission move you to action rather than the hatred moving you towards action. So we are reflecting on that. We're reflecting on who we are and what we stand for, on what moves us, on our impulsive behavior. She's also retrograde in Aries, which is Mars's sign, and Mars is still in Cancer in the shadow of its retrograde. So these two retrogrades, these are so connected, right? If the Mars retrograde adjusted our estimations of our own personal power, Venus retrograde will change what we are working towards and moving towards with that new knowledge of Mars. It will have to look different. It will have to look different. And now there's many players, right? It will have to speak differently. That will be the Mercury retrograde piece. It will look different. Venus, as she retrogrades backwards, she will conjoin the sun at the very beginning of Aries. So that Cazimi that happens on March 22nd. And then the Mercury Cazimi happens on March 24th. Right? Those will be the moments and the gem of wisdom that comes from these retrogrades. That happens in Aries. But then Venus will retrograde back into Pisces, where she will join with Saturn, and she will make deep commitments and deep vows over what is truly valuable in the world, and remembering that a hero is just a madman unless she is working for the good of the collective, right? Aries is an individual only in an illusory sense, only an individual in that it sparks out of the universal, which is Pisces. In truth, it is not separated. And Venus goes back for her calling and her love and goes back into the sign of her exaltation to remember what all of this is for before she stations direct on April 12th and moves forward with Saturn. Mercury will be doing a similar thing. Our experience of Venus retrograde will inform the conversations that we are having and the thoughts that we are having in its mirror image in the Mercury retrograde. They are beginning a cycle anew. And when they station direct, Venus and Mercury, then all of these personal planets, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, will be in their beginning stages. And so we are going back to find what Joseph Campbell called our bliss, right? A Venus retrograde is looking for her bliss. And I don't mean bliss in an airy, fairy, ethereal sense of the world, but your bliss, which is the power of walking the path that something in you resonates that you must walk down. And that will also mean radically surrendering to your work that is only your work and not being distracted by the work of others or the people that might want to have you carry their burdens or do their work for them. This is the part where everybody has to carry their own weight, and we do have to move into a kind of new reality with our own missions. I find that a good way to practice this is to spend the first part of the Venus retrograde actively sacrificing or letting go of things. These can be physical things. These can be things that you wanted to happen that now you don't. This can be looking in your life for what you are ambivalent about and getting rid of it. So that when your heart is renewed and your mission is renewed, there is clarity in the path because you're not trying to carry all of these hobbies or relationships or projects that you know somewhere are not really yours anymore. And in the middle of it, we get eclipses to help you clean house. We will have a lunar eclipse at 24 degrees of Virgo, which will be visible if you stay up till midnight on March 13th or early in the morning of March 14th, depending on your time zone. And we will have another one a solar eclipse that will not be visible in the US on March 29th, our final Aries eclipse. So I hope this is helpful. I hope it gives you a path for thinking about the Mars retrograde and the upcoming Venus retrograde. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.